Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching us from. My name is Spencer Cronin, and I am JCRC's Director of Educational Partnerships. One note that I will just give before I formally introduce our guest is that this program was initially planned live for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, but the massive amount of snow Boston got had other plans. So to really sort of set the stage for us, I'm going to give a little bit of an introductory remarks as though we were there for that event live. So as we commemorate 81 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by Allied forces, we are faced with the sobering reality that we will soon be doing so without living witnesses. For decades, hearing from survivors of the Holocaust has been an integral part of how we memorialize and teach about this atrocity. These firsthand accounts leave a profound and sometimes life-changing impact on the people who hear them, I think especially young people. So how do we move forward with teaching students about the Holocaust in the absence of these firsthand accounts? And it's with this question in mind that we are so glad to have our guest with us today. In recent years, descendants of survivors are increasingly taking on this responsibility of preserving history, whether it's researching family stories, publishing books, sharing the lives and lessons of their parents, grandparents, and other family members. And we are incredibly fortunate to have one of those descendants doing this incredible work with us here today. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Julie Brill. Julie is the author of the new book, Hidden in Plain Sight, a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia, which Menachem Kaiser called a powerful reminder of why our stories, personal, familial, and historical, are so crucial. She has written for Haaretz, The Forward, Kveler, The Times of Israel, Balkan Insight, Boston's national public radio station, and elsewhere. Julie shares her family's experiences in the Holocaust in middle and high school classrooms through 3GNY and is a co-facilitator for Living Links WEDU training. Julie, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I think to start, can you tell us a little bit about your family's history in the Holocaust, particularly your dad, since he features so prominently in your book, and how he survived the war?
Sure. So my dad was born in 1938 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. So his very earliest memories are of the war in Belgrade and of the Holocaust. And I grew up hearing those stories and not really having the context for them. I think a lot of times children and grandchildren of survivors, we kind of learn the story from the inside out. So we learn like the very personal, immediate stories without the context. That was certainly the case for me. So I had these flashbulb memories of my dad going through the war, and I didn't really know what they meant. But what I understood as a child was, he was born in the Jewish neighborhood of Dorchel. He was the first child of his parents. He lived with his paternal uncles as well, his father's younger brothers. And life was like pretty good in Belgrade until the occupation. And it happened very quickly. His father was rounded up and forced to do slave labor for the Reich. And he was digging ditches and laying pipe. The bombing of the city destroyed the sewer system. So he was involved in rebuilding the sewer system, and my father remembered that. And then all of the Jewish men disappeared very early in the war. So the war starts in Belgrade in April 1941, and the men are gone by November. And then my father and my grandmother, and by then my aunt had been born, my infant aunt, were able to survive the rest of the war just on the outskirts of Belgrade, sort of hiding in plain sight. That's where the title of the book comes from. And we know what happened to my grandfather, but of course my grandmother never really did. Yeah, so the Holocaust story in Serbia is very different from what I had learned in Hebrew school. There aren't any trains. There aren't, distant camps. My grandfather did slave labor, but came home every night for months, which was sort of an unusual arrangement. They didn't have camps coming up yet. And then one day he disappeared. It's one of my father's earliest memories. He remembers my grandmother screaming and crying. Of course, she didn't know what had happened. She couldn't, there was no phone. She couldn't go outside because of the curfew. She was pregnant with my aunt. And she, of course, assumed the worst, that he was dead. And actually what had happened was they had the camp up and running. The Germans had a camp in the city in Belgrade, a terrible place where there was nothing. And so the Jewish women of Dorchel, of the Jewish neighborhood, had to bring them food. So the mothers, the sisters, the daughters, the wives of these men were bringing them supplies so they could survive. And there's actually a letter from the leader of the Jewish community begging the Germans, could they please have straw? Could the men have straw to sleep on at night instead of the bare ground? So they really was very, very minimal what they had there. And so my grandmother did that. She brought my grandfather food from around the time of my father's third birthday, that's August 1941, until sometime in November when she arrived and the camp gates were open, camp was empty. My grandfather had really just disappeared. And my grandmother believed the rumors, which were, they had moved the men to do work elsewhere, which made sense. My grandfather was in his early 30s. He'd been healthy and fit. And actually, we now know, because I've found the information through research, we have the date that he was murdered. So we have a yard site date. The Germans had a system where every time the partisans shot one of their soldiers, they killed 100 civilians. And for an injured soldier, they killed 50 civilians. So it wasn't all Jews, but the Jews and the Roma were in this camp. So they were easily sourced for this retaliation killing, this terrible math. And that's what happened to my grandfather. But as a kid, I sort of thought, I knew he had been killed by Germans, and I also somehow thought the Holocaust hadn't really gotten to Serbia because it didn't fit into the story we heard.
Yeah, I think that's, you said it doesn't sort of fit into this narrative that you learned in Hebrew school, and you talk about this in the book, which is something that I so appreciate, that, your family story doesn't fit neatly into this common narrative of the Holocaust that the sort of collective we have, and what comes to mind for many, right? Germany, ghettos, trains.
Exactly.
Camps. It sort of follows this very linear path. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think it's so important that we expand our understandings of where and when and why and how the Holocaust happened, especially as we're talking about transmitting this history to students.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. It's the reason I wrote the book was there are 6 million Holocaust stories, but there are millions of Holocaust stories that don't fit into the narrative. I think a lot of times when people think Holocaust, they think Auschwitz. They think this giant death camp. 1 million Jews were murdered there. It was terrible. But they were also work camps there. So there were survivors. There were actually tens of thousands of Jewish survivors, mostly in their teens and 20s, who survived Auschwitz. And many of them went on to live long lives and tell their story. So that's the story that we know. There's something called the Auschwitz paradox. That's Timothy Snyder's term, the historian Timothy Snyder. And he says, we know so much about Auschwitz because of the survivors. More Jews were killed outside the camps than in them. And we don't know their stories because you need survivors and now descendants to tell those stories. But my family is a more typical story of what happened in Eastern Europe, where Jews were killed right near where they lived. There were no gas chambers and there were no cattle cars. So all the stories are important, but I really wanted this story to be known.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And again, I think it's just so important as we sort of seek to transmit this history to next generations that we give voices to more of those stories, both of those who survived and those who didn't, who don't fit neatly into that commonly understood narrative.
Exactly.
So shifting gears a little bit to you, can you tell us a little bit about how you first learned about your dad and your family story and what it was like growing up with this history?
Yes. I really absorbed his childhood memories almost as my own, which I think is common with second generation folks, people whose parents were survivors. My father was a child survivor. He wasn't even 3 when the war started. So he had these very specific, very short memories. And it was almost like he was the child who had experienced them telling me I was a child listening to them. They almost became like my memories. And so I had these stories. I didn't really know what they meant. And I had these pictures, just a few of them. I would study them. I had one of my grandparents on their wedding day, a second one of my grandfather holding my father as a baby. And there's the one that was on the cover of the book. That's my father and my young aunt, and they are standing on the street in occupied Belgrade. That's the spring of 1943. Belgrade was one of the first cities to be declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. That was in the spring of 1942. So a year later, here are these Jewish children just standing on the street, not hiding. And I would ask my dad, like, how is this possible? And he would say, it's a child's understanding. My grandmother and my mother were tough women, and they wouldn't let me, get hurt. They wouldn't let anything happen to me. And so they were able to preserve his sense of safety. It's really amazing. And now I know that you couldn't just take a picture on the street in occupied Europe. You couldn't own a camera. It was illegal. So to just somehow my grandmother got this picture, and I think she was trying to save it for her husband, for my grandfather, to show him, the part of the childhood that he had missed.
So growing up, you sort of know you have these sort of childhood stories that, again, are just sort of very foundational family stories. As you get older, and assuming, you start to learn about the Holocaust in places like Hebrew school, maybe in public school, just a greater sense of, adulthood and things that come with that. When do you start to sort of put those pieces together and sort of map your family story onto this larger history?
Yes, very slowly. I mean, so I came of age in the 1980s and went to public school in the Boston area. We had no Holocaust education at all. In Hebrew school, we had too much Holocaust education, if that's possible, a very brutal education, no holds back education. And I was just terrified. I knew what had happened to my grandfather. I wondered who might hide me, if I could pass as Christian, if I could survive when Hitler came. I was just, the Holocaust did not seem far away or long ago at all. And then I really kind of put it away as much as I could after Hebrew school and tried not to think about it. That doesn't really work. And then in middle age, started to really research it and understand the context. It's really only recently that my father has come to think of himself as a survivor. Initially, survivors were just people who had come through the camps. My father wasn't in a camp. Children survivors have really been dismissed as being too young to understand what had happened or have credible memories. And so for a long time, they really were ignored. Now they're all we have. And so that people are starting to listen to his story, especially because of the book, and ask questions. But that's really something that's happened to him in his 80s. I really couldn't be the daughter of a survivor until he realized that he was a survivor. So it's been really a recent process.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, talking about your dad thinking about himself as a survivor. And I want to pick up on a term that you already used once in this conversation, which is the idea of a second generation, or a 2G, which I think a lot of people probably watching this are familiar with. But can you talk a little bit about what that label means to you?
Yeah, so thank you. We have 2Gs. Those are the children of Holocaust survivors. 3Gs that are the grandchildren. There are 4Gs. My experience, I think, is not typical because I am a very young 2G. So a lot of the 2Gs were born in displaced persons camps. They were born immediately after the war. So we're talking 40s and 50s. I was born in 1970 because my father was so young that I am young. So I'm a Gen X 2G, which is not that typical. And also my father talked about his war memories, which a lot of survivors didn't. Sometimes they talked about it to their grandchildren later, but they didn't talk about it to their children. So it's really been kind of a process to understand what my legacy is and what this means for me and then for my kids, because there were so few survivors from Serbia and now so few descendants. I feel like kind of nobody asked me to do this, but like as a spokesperson, like I have to tell the story. I feel this obligation to let people know what happened.
Yeah. So sort of picking up on that theme, obviously the core of this book is you researching and uncovering your own family history across generations. And I really want to spend some time on that as a sort of universal theme, because we all have family histories. And I was particularly struck by the bit where you mentioned very early on that, one of your elementary school teachers asks, where can people point out on the map where they come from? And you're the only one who knew or raised their hand to volunteer that info. So why is family history so important? And what are some ways that especially educators who might be watching this can think about tapping into that as a way to enhance student learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot. I mean, think about why am I telling this story to children? It's not an easy story to listen to. And one of the reasons is because I mentioned, I learned my Holocaust history, family history from the inside out. I learned these very specific memories that my father had, and then I learned the historical context. Everybody is living through history. Everybody's grandparents lived through history. And so it's really an invitation to children to go home and talk to the oldest family members that they have access to and record what they're saying and write it down and ask questions, because they can all learn their history from the inside out. What happened on 9/11, what happened with the civil rights movement, whatever the history is that their families lived through. Let's hear about it. Elie Wiesel talks about when you just talk to a witness or you hear a witness, you become a witness. We think of that in the Holocaust context, but it's a broader context as well. Everybody has family stories, and we want to record them and hold on to them before they're lost.
Yeah. And I really like what you just said about we are all living through history right now. Everybody feels like we are, you hear the phrase unprecedented times thrown around. And I sometimes have the sense that term has been thrown around for much longer than we think.
Yeah.
And I really like this idea of thinking about both the past, but the fact that we are living in what will eventually be studied as the past, and, prompting especially young people to think about, what do you want generations forward to remember, not only about this particular moment, but what you were experiencing as you were going through it. And I think, like you said, we talk about this a lot in the context of the Holocaust because it is one of the most studied periods in history, but it really can be applied across historical moments and sort of forward looking to today. So I really appreciate that. When did this sort of research and journey into your family's history become a book?
Yeah. I started originally, I wanted to be able to share it with my dad. I wanted to pass up this history to him that really had been stolen by the Nazis, because he hadn't had the opportunity to study, the history of Serbia in World War II. He lived through it, but he lived through one corner of it. And I wanted to be able to pass it down to my children and my niece and nephew. And that was really the beginning of the research. There's a moment where I am in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., and for people who've been there, there's a large bookstore, and the books are arranged alphabetically by country. And I'm trying to get information on Serbia. I haven't had much luck finding information in English. And so I walk down this long aisle and I'm looking for Y for Yugoslavia. And I get there and there's no Y. There's no Yugoslavia. There really hadn't been a book written on the Holocaust in Serbia in English. And that was when I realized, I guess I will write this book. And the whole time I thought, maybe someone else, there's some other descendant somewhere who's going to, write a book. I don't know them, and it's going to come out before mine, and I'll just, stop. And that didn't happen. And so I kept working on it. It was like an 8-year project to get the book out into the world.
Wow. I really, I love this idea that you keep talking about of learning about the Holocaust inside out. From these sort of small stories that lead us to a much bigger picture. And I think that is actually a very prominent trend in the way that we are studying the Holocaust now, which we are less writing these sort of massive historical overviews, these like meta narratives, and we are much more looking into micro histories, these very tiny towns, and how did, each individual sort of municipality across Europe experience the Holocaust.
Right.
And I think and to the point of Inside Out, it is changing our broader understandings of how the Holocaust happened, I think particularly in places like Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's part of how we can bring Holocaust education or understanding to children, because 6 million is such a large, unrelatable number. But if you can hear about one person who has a name and a face and a life before the war, I think that's how we relate to it. And, there's much more research to be done. There's 1 million missing people whose names we don't know yet who were murdered in the Holocaust. So there's a lot still left to be researched and found out.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your contribution to that work. I want to shift gears a little bit to pick up on another thread that I really appreciated from your book, which is the role that sites of memory play.
Yeah.
So whether it's cemeteries, museums, apartments, memorials, the Stolperstein, which we can talk more about in a second, but you know, we are here at JCRC the sort of educational stewards of the New England Holocaust Memorial, which is another site of memory and site of learning for a lot of students across the New England area and beyond. So can you talk a little bit more about the impact that these different places had on your journey, and the role that they can play in furthering Holocaust education?
Yeah, I mean, that's so important. I wanted to go back to Serbia. I say back to Serbia, though I had never been. And I wanted to go with my dad, in part to see the places where the stories I had heard took place. But also I was hopeful that when we stood in places where he had experienced things, he would have new recall, memories that he had forgotten would come back, which happened. And so that was one of the reasons to be back in those places. When we were in Belgrade, we went to the Jewish cemetery there. And that was just surprisingly meaningful for me. I really like cemeteries. I hang out in cemeteries in New England all the time. I think that you can see a lot about kind of what happened to a family, when did they die and who were they and how old were they? And there's stories to be seen on the gravestones. But to go to Belgrade and be in a place where this was my family history was really hugely meaningful. We were able to repair my great-grandmother's stone. And there's an idea in Judaism that the biggest mitzvah, the biggest gift you can give is to the dead, because they can't repay you. So you do something for a living person, and even if you don't expect it, they might somehow do something for you, but the dead won't. So being able to fix her stone was amazing. And it really just helped me understand how my father really is from Belgrade. It's his hometown. There's a saying in Vermont, you're a Vermonter if you have 4 grandparents in the ground. And I am never going to be from anywhere by that definition. But my father is, his grandparents are in the ground in Belgrade. He's from there. And so that was really kind of just hit me when we were there in the cemetery. I really understood it on a different level. We went to the place where my father had lived before and after the war. Solinska 8 is the address, and stood there. It was a Jewish community for hundreds of years. It's a Jewish neighborhood without Jews now. If you look closely, you can see a little Hebrew lettering. There's a Star of David in one place, but the residents aren't Jewish, and I sort of had the feeling like they don't even know what happened. I mean, like, no shade, we don't know a lot of the history of where we lived either, but they're walking by and it's not meaningful to them at all. And that led to, you mentioned the Stolpersteine project.
Yeah. So tell us, speaking of helping people know the history that they're quite literally walking over, tell us about the Stolperstein, what those are, what that was like to make that happen for your father and for your family members.
Yeah. So if people have ever been to Western Europe, if you walk by the last voluntary residence of where Jews lived before the war, you might see these little stones in the cobblestones or in the sidewalk in front of the building. And they're called Stolpersteine. They would fit in the palm of your hand. They're about 4 centimeters square. And they say just enough. So you know the name of the person who lived there, the date of their birth, the date that they died, and one sentence, it will say, deported to Auschwitz. And then you can kind of fill in the rest. And you see, it was a husband and wife living together, and they had so many children, and also her mother lived there. You can really kind of get the sense of what was happening. When I was at my father's street and feeling like no one knows the history, I really wanted to get these stones. And I just thought, it's like some oversight. No one has done it yet, but I'll just do it. American optimism. Here we go. And of course, it wasn't an oversight. There were no stones in Serbia at that point. This is 2017. There were no stones in any of the countries of the former Yugoslavia. And in fact, in Serbia, there were no markers anywhere with the names of victims of the Holocaust. And so good that I didn't know all that when I started. I was able to pair up with this NGO called Haver Serbia. It took 5 years, and we were able to get the first stones in Belgrade in 2022. So I went back with my father and my daughter, and there was this installation. It turned out to be on my grandfather's birthday of the stone. There were 3 Brill stones and 7 other stones in Belgrade. And this summer, the plan is that the rest of the stones will go in. So the idea with the installation is that the survivors and victims are united. Initially, Serbia said no to having survivor stones, but now they are going in, hopefully this summer. So my father and my aunt and my grandmother will all get stones on the street. Sounds cool. Okay.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
No, I think they are one of my favorite memorial projects.
Yes, me too.
Both in the Holocaust and more generally, because it really hammers home in a very sort of casual and innocuous way just how affected every place and every person was by this history. I think a lot about tying this back to what do we want students to know about this history. The two of the biggest things for me always, the Holocaust happened everywhere in Europe and in some way, shape, or form to everyone in Europe.
Yes.
Right. And I think that really helps drive that home, whether you're walking down the street, whether you're going to what's now a shopping mall, whether you're going to your local bakery. That's everywhere that you are in a place that was in some way, shape, or form affected by the Holocaust.
Yeah. And I think on some levels still is. There's a program in the U.S. Where they do something based on the Stolpersteine project outside the homes of where enslaved people lived. There's one in Medford, Mass. And I went there and I thought, we have to think about our history. I wasn't living here, obviously, in the early 1800s, but we still have the legacy of that. So learning to live with what's happened in history, where we are.
Yeah. Staying with this sort of sites of memory thread for a little bit, so we've talked about sort of actual historical sites where these things took place. I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we intentionally or unintentionally commemorate these things.
Yeah.
Monuments, sites of memory. I talked about, we have the New England Holocaust Memorial. I was very struck by somewhere on your journey, you stop at a Holocaust memorial that is sort of very, again, to use that word, sort of innocuous. It's, I think you talk about somebody's like skateboarding across it or that sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these memorial sites and how they showed up in your journey and what they made you think about and feel?
Yeah. I mean, so, we're on this trip. My dad and my 20-year-old daughter and I were in Belgrade. We're going to all of these sites looking for answers, looking for closure, looking for it to mean something. And the site that you are referring to is where the women and children were held. It's called Saimiste. So after the men were gone, that's November of 1941, they round up the women and the children and the elderly in Belgrade, and they hold them in this, was a former fairgrounds, and it's right across the Sava River in a very obvious place. So there's a lot of discussion in Holocaust education and Holocaust history of who knew what and who knew what when. The Serbs for sure knew what was happening because the Germans wanted them to. So they built this camp in plain view of the city, and they're holding Jewish women and children there, and then eventually murdering them. There's only one survivor of that camp, someone who was smuggled out as a baby. We actually met her at the Stolpersteine installation. Wow. This old woman, I talked to her. My cousin was interpreting because I don't speak Serbian. And she thought her parents and my grandparents must have been friends because they lived across the street from each other and they were about the same age. We went to see that memorial. And I mean, some places in Europe are camps and some places in Europe that were camps are museums. And this is not. And so there was literally a skateboarder with earbuds listening to some music sitting on this memorial. And I just thought, I don't know how you live with that kind of horror. We have our own horror in American history that we live with, but not this way. Like it just felt so disrespectful and empty.
Yeah. And I think in some ways sort of an apt analogy for as this, in many cases, as this was unfolding in real time in Serbia, perhaps similar attitudes to the way some of this other Serbian people, the non-Jewish Serbian people were were thinking about this as it was unfolding.
I mean, I think about that a lot. The only reason the Holocaust happened outside of Germany was collaboration of civilians. The way that the Germans got to the Jews was that the local people pointed them out. In Serbia, there was a lot of resistance, armed resistance with the partisans, and there was a lot of collaboration. And we found a street pass for my grandfather that gave him permission to be out on the street because of the curfew, because he had to report to work. And of course, it's in Serbian. It was local people who were administering that low-level part of the Holocaust. Yeah, we talk about that with the kids.
Yeah, and I think that is, again, one of the things that I really hope gets transmitted in teaching young people about the Holocaust is that while Nazi Germany was the sort of, obviously, the primary party responsible for this, they could not nearly have carried it out, to your point, to the scale and to the degree that they did without mass collaboration from every country they were in, whether it was a country they occupied or a country that was allied with them. It took people on the ground to make this happen, which I think is really important for us as we think about not only just responsibility for this atrocity, but what it takes to what we need to be learning from it and thinking about it and what we need to be applying in the present.
Very much so, yeah.
So I could continue to talk to you forever about this, but as we sort of start to wrap this up, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how you're thinking about passing this on to the coming generations. Again, we are facing this very imminent reality where there will soon no longer be direct witnesses to the Holocaust, leaving descendants like yourself as the closest ones to this history, particularly ones like you who have invested so much time, energy, and effort into learning it, into preserving it, into making sense of it. So what do you think is most important to pass on to young people? And then my second part of that question is, how can those watching, particularly the educators watching, what can they do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot. I don't think there's any point in talking about this unless we're making it relevant for today. I mean, history is fine, but the reason we talk about history is because there are lessons for the present. So Timothy Snyder says the only difference between us living now and Jews in Germany in the 1930s is we know this history. And so we want to pass that history on. We want kids to know that history and to think about what it means and how it applies to what is happening around the world right now. So when I talk to kids, I always ask them, think about as you're hearing my family story, why does this matter? Why are we talking about this? And my answer for it is that the day in July of 2022, when we got the Stolpersteine in the ground in Belgrade, and we had a little celebration in Belgrade, my dad's hometown, while that was happening in Boston, where we are right now, like less than a mile from here, in my hometown, neo-Nazis were walking on the Freedom Trail. They had a march. It was a July 4th rally. So if we think that any of this history is long ago or far away, the lesson to children is that it's not. I think as we get older, we feel like the past maybe is even closer. Like 50 years doesn't seem like as long ago as it did when I was a kid. But to kids, often anything that happened before they were born is just ancient history. And so we're just telling them about the past so that they can interpret and make decisions right now in the present. And when they're adults, they'll be able to, bring this history forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Julie, thank you so much for spending some time with us, for all the work that you've done. Hidden in Plain Sight is out and available. Highly recommend. A phenomenal book, phenomenal story. And best of luck as you continue this incredible work.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you to JCRC for having me and helping me share my family story.